So it's been a while. I plan to give myself a break so as to not get fatigued from so much Final Fantasy 15-ness, but I didn't expect it to be 6 months. Anyway, once Final Fantasy 15 was released to the public in November of 2016 to pretty good reviews, that was only really the beginning of development on free updates to add new scenes or fulfill promises made in trailers, as well as the paid Season Pass DLC that was sold at launch, meant to expand on the characters. A common complaint, especially when these episodes were coming out, is that they should have been included in the game, some of which were insinuating that these were being cut out of the game and sold separately, which I know that that's not how games are developed for the most part. It also doesn't help that each episode got a little in-game advertisement in the original game, with each party member returning with some sort of scar from their off-screen travels. Also, season passes are just a bad PR thing all around. I'm glad that Square learned this and fixed it by the time they got to 7 Remake. But apparently Stranger of Paradise didn't get the fucking memo. That video is gonna be a headache. What initially started as just some extra content meant to appease fans quickly turned into an entire thing with its own development woes. Because nothing with Final Fantasy 15 and its damn curse will ever be simple at this fucking point, and I don't know why I expect it to be anymore. Episode Gladiolus was the first piece of Final Fantasy 15 DLC to be released, coming out only 3 months after the base game. I don't remember it being that soon. Of course, it and the rest of the advertised episodes were a part of the Season Pass, however you could buy them all separately for only $5, which is extremely fair. After replaying it for the first time in 7 years, I can easily say that episode Gladio isn't my favorite of the bunch at all, but it still manages to jam a lot of Final Fantasy-ness in the shortest runtime of them all, coming in at barely an hour. The story takes place during Chapter 7, and is all about Cor assisting Gladio in his journey to get stronger in order to be a better shield for Noctis. He wants to do this by seeking out Gilgamesh the Blade Master and beating his ass, and after treading through the ruins and single-handedly defeating an onslaught of mini-bosses, Gladio defeats Gilgamesh and brings back his weapon as a trophy. The end. Now, I'll say that overall the idea for this is neat. Using Gilgamesh as an in-universe legendary test of strength feels satisfying as a Final Fantasy fan, since he's infamously the most difficult boss in each respective incarnation. I like that the whole DLC is framed as a campfire story, making it all feel complementary to the main game, rather than some important moment that we all missed. I appreciate Cor's role as Gladio's mentor. He was a fan-favorite character in the original game that got too little screen time, but his role here, where he's constantly giving Gladio advice, as well as retelling stories of when he, Gladio's father, and King Regis were on their own journey, really amplifies the uncle-ness of his character. As a game, the entire DLC really is just one massive dungeon, which I think works in its favor. The areas explored in episode Gladio are much more visually striking and distinct than any of the dungeons I can think of in 15, which were all mostly just dark caverns riddled with mobs and confusing doors. While here, there's piles of bodies left behind showing how few were able to pass the trials that Gladio is attempting. There's lots of jagged terrain and glowing primary colors, making for a beautiful area that I wish was explorable in the main game. Episode Gladio is fittingly a bit more difficult than the original 15. Majority of your major fights are done completely solo. Instead of warp striking or phasing, Gladio can simply dodge and parry. He also doesn't level up either. So instead of campfires allowing you to get stronger, there's simply checkpoints for Gladio to catch his breath and eat cup noodles, because we need the advertisement, obviously. But Gladio can clearly hold this game on his own. He controls a bit closer to a character action game, especially with his additional ability to grab a pillar and start swinging it around at demons. It never failed to make me laugh. The final battle with Gilgamesh is a steep spike in difficulty I had to retry at least 3 times. However, since there's no XP or alternate gear, it's solely a test of skill, which fits the theme of the story. However, once you defeat Gilgamesh, have a short conversation, and he concedes his weapon, it all abruptly ends. And that's sort of why I appreciate episode Gladio, but I don't really love it, or even particularly like it a lot. Gladio's whole arc is about not feeling powerful enough after being stalked by Ravis. Feels a little bit of a cop-out reason for this entire story. This episode is the shortest of them all because it simply lacks any depth. The story is just about obtaining the power, and that's it. which is a shame. I like the dungeon. I like the rock inspiration some of the backing tracks here have. I appreciate the additional content like a New Game Plus mode with Gilgamesh's Blade, a score attack mode, which would be added into Final Fantasy XVI of all things, and the final trial against Core is the hardest fight in all of Final Fantasy XV, hands down. But while in later episodes those all feel like great additional goodies, here it feels like it's trying to make up for how shallow this main story is. Gladio goes through no character change, no arc whatsoever, he just gets the thing that he wants. The end. Since these were released separately, when episode Gladio released in March of 2017, that was it for 15 until Prompto would release in June. And as much as I liked it when I first played it back then, it's not a great first impression for a $25 season pass. Looking at it now, separated from that initial excitement, it's good, it's fine, but you'll quickly come to see that it's the least ambitious of all of these episodes, and is frankly the one I thought about the least in the time since my initial playthrough. Episode Prompto is, in a lot of ways, a major step up from Gladio, and somehow a bit more frustrating than it with how safe Square ended up playing it. The story is set during Chapter 12, and is solely about Prompto figuring out his origin of being a cloned soldier from Niflheim. Aranea shows up to help him destroy both the scientists that made Prompto, as well as his new prototype form as a robot. After they double tap his dad, not in a fun way, Prompto decides to return to his best buds, only for Ardyn to capture him again, leading to his reappearance near the end of Chapter 13. The end. Criticisms of his dad barely being a character if you haven't seen the Kingsglaive movie aside, you can immediately see the jump in storytelling. Prompto is given the second longest episode, which makes sense since his absence and eventual reveal in the original game was the most glaring out of the main party. From being pushed off the train to showing up hours later right before the end of the game with this gigantic lore dump about being a bioengineered soldier who was originally meant to, infiltrate Lucis, and he figured it out off on screen, I don't fucking know. So episode Prompto, more than any other piece of DLC related to 15, is almost required to fill that missing piece of the puzzle. The imagery is not subtle at all, but I like that we at least get to see Prompto at its lowest point as he begins to figure out what it is that he wants in life. But it's Aranea's inclusion that feels a little bit off. I like her character. I have a crush on her. It makes sense why she would come to help Prompto after speaking to Noctis in Tenebrae, but it just doesn't feel right, you know? For some reason, she just feels a little bit shoehorned in here so that there can be another temporary party member from the original game. The ending is a little bit rushed here as well, and again, this entire character has one scene in the original game. It only gets 2 minutes on screen here, but we're supposed to feel connected to him because he made Prompto in a fucking lab with a box of scraps. I do like what episode Prompto was going for. It's a little more out there than episode Gladio, especially with scenes like the Nightmare where you play as a Magitek soldier running away from Noctis. But I almost wish that stuff was expanded upon with this psychological horror twist. At certain points that almost feels like what some of the game was going for, but it's too set in this Metal Gear Solid recreation to get that weird. Only the AI isn't smart enough to notice that you're there, so the stealth just feels like a waste of time. However, as an action shooter, it plays fun enough. I enjoy the variety in Prompto's arsenal, as well as the ability to grab different weapons like a bazooka or an SMG. I was kind of wrong in my original Final Fantasy XV video when I said that the DLC builds were just dragged and dropped into the main game, at least when it came to Prompto. 5% wrong. Here, instead of a bazooka, that fourth slot is taken up by a baton, which sucks. It makes no sense to have that when the revolver already has infinite ammo. Outside of the main story, there's the semi-open world of the tundra surrounding the Niflheim labs. It's not huge, but there's some side quests to do, all of which are really short and cut all the extra fluff so that they don't get in my way at all. You can upgrade your snowmobile with the parts you get from said side content, and once you complete a first run of the story, you unlock an additional weapon, a time trial mode, and a boss fight with Aranea, which will pretty much become the norm for the rest of these episodes. Unlike any other DLC in this video, I do remember returning to episode Prompto after my initial playthrough to just drive around and beat some of the mini-bosses. Something that can't really be said for Gladio or Ignis. With as many gripes or complaints that I have with the story, episode Prompto felt less like more Final Fantasy XV and a bit closer to something that's in its own category. Although I still don't think that Square hit the nail on the head quite yet. Close, but no cigar. Comrades, or Multiplayer Expansion Comrades, was sold as the online co-op counterpart to 15. It's set 6 months into Noctis' 10-year rest while the world is overrun with demons. You play as a member of the Kingsglaive, here to redistribute power to all the different cities in Eos, as well as to save survivors and kill demons. That's about it. If you want more story, you'll be disappointed, as there's only about 30 or so minutes of it worth in a 20-hour game. Comrades takes the gameplay of 15 and shoves it into a Monster Hunter-esque experience, which is fine. I've just never seen a dev team Metal Gear survive their own project. But to start off with the positives, as a reskin of 15, the combat is fine. There are new mechanics like defensive and offensive spells, thank God, as well as some new weapons, which does give this game a bit of its own identity. The character creator is a bit bare bones in terms of base options like altering faces and hairstyles, many of which you have to buy throughout the game as style magazines, but once you obtain more hairstyles and clothes, the character creator is actually pretty in-depth. I do like the idea of the game. Seeing this period in time actually play out is interesting conceptually. Seeing characters like Iris and Calcut do their part to help the efforts makes us feel a lot more connected to the original game than just some throwaway spin-off. It is very obvious that this is just a recycle of 15 assets, but I appreciate that there was some more put into it. Except, I fucking hate this game. The gameplay loop of Comrades is this: complete a hunt, get power, redistribute power to connect to other outposts and obtain more quests, repeat until finished. It's a game that you play in the background at best, which is okay. Everything isn't going to be the most talented, most interesting, and most extraordinary game in the universe. The fact is, I'd be alright with Comrades if repetitive quests were my only issue. No, see, my biggest issue with Comrades is simply fucking playing it in 2024. The player base is a ghost town, and on console, you're still required to have PlayStation Plus or Xbox Live to play online, which you can only do if you're playing the standalone release. If you don't meet any of those parameters, you'll have to play with bots. Only the AI is brain dead. I've had many a situation where I'm completing a quest and lose right at the final stretch due to my team members simply not doing their part. And it's not like the quests in Comrades are all very short. Some of the beefier ones go for upwards of 10 minutes. All to do it over and probably fail again because you can't take on 20 demons on your own. Not to mention that leveling is slow, forcing you to replay many of the same quests in order to get to a higher level in the first place. In my 5 hours of playing Comrades, I've only gotten to level 6, in a game with a level cap of 50. That is fucking insane. Playing Comrades solo should be recognized by the United Nations as a form of torture, and I will stand on that hill. To make matters worse, at some point Square realized that having an entire multiplayer game sold only to those with a season pass is a terrible fucking idea, around the same time that they wanted to remove a lot of the online features from the base Final Fantasy XV. So Comrades was transitioned into a standalone game on all platforms for $20. That is, except for PC. The one platform where multiplayer is free, its servers are just offline. And if you are able to find some workaround, good fucking luck, Charlie, finding someone to actually play with. I'm sure that this got so confusing that people just gave up and played A Realm Reborn for free. I wish Comrades was developed more as a separate entity from the jump, maybe by a different dev team, as opposed to a red-headed stepchild that's just now been drowned in the backyard. This isn't like Final Fantasy 11 or 14, both of which offer entirely unique experiences. Comrades is kind of a lesser version of a game that I have already completed. Maybe if it was given more time in the oven or wasn't abandoned so fast, I'd give it a little bit more grace. But the reality is that this is the worst thing related to Final Fantasy 15 and is completely worth skipping. Episode Ignis is paradoxically the one I remember the least, as well as the most iconic of the bunch solely for its ending, which I'll get to in due time. The story takes place during the fight with Leviathan in Chapter 9, and is about Ignis trying to find Noct and Altissia, all the while pushing back Niflheim's army. Eventually Ravus joins him in search of Luna, only to find her lifeless body because, you know. Ravus turns on you because he's pissed off at Noct, and begins the best boss fight in the episode. Then, once he calms down, Ardyn shows up and almost kills Noctis. But Ignis puts on the Ring of the Loose Sea, a royal weapon that will kill those who it deems unworthy. When Ravus wore it in Kingsglaive, it took his arm, and when Ignis wears it, it takes his eyesight, thus explaining how Ignis went blind off-screen. Ignis protects Noct from Ardyn until the others get there, fulfilling his role as his protector. Ardyn disappears and Ravus leaves, and then the story goes on like it did in the original game. The end. You can tell that the devs realized that creating an entire 2-ish hour story solely around Ignis going blind seemed like kind of a weak idea. So instead, the episode becomes the most character-focused out of them all. If for some reason you were planning on only playing one episode, you should probably play episode Ignis. If you didn't already love his character in the original game, then you'll adore him by the end of this. And the same goes for Ravus. Not only does it allow a great character to finally get more screen time, but his inclusion adds to the tension. The shaky union that he makes with Ignis despite still resenting Noctis, only to completely snap once finding Luna's lifeless body, is so good. It adds a lot more to the story of the original, fleshing out both Ignis and Ravus as two people who would do what they must for those that they care about the most. The reveal that after Altissia, Ignis knew that Noctis would have to sacrifice himself by the end adds a new layer of beautiful tragedy to that game. Episode Ignis is just the perfect DLC for Final Fantasy XV, hands down. It manages to add a lot to the original game in a way that felt fitting. Seeing a set piece like Titan stopping Niflheim from an outside perspective is the exact sort of thing I wanted from these episodes. And finally being able to see Eos through Ignis's eyes is great. You know, and until he loses that. It also helps the combat and traversal here are pretty good. Ignis plays much more like a hack and slash game, with his elemental weapons functioning more like different battle stances. It's fine, although he zips around a little bit too much for my taste. Throughout the episode, Ignis will help the Altician forces on the front lines. There's a power balance meter that doesn't really do much but show when an area is controlled by Niflheim, and it'll turn blue when you kill all the enemies in a specific part. That's really it. You're not required to save the entire city, there's no reward for defeating all of the Magitech soldiers, but running around rooftops and ziplining into battles is probably the most fun I've had in Final Fantasy XV when it comes to traversal and random encounters. The scale of this episode is grand, to say the least. Lots of these moments in this relatively short runtime are big enough to rival the original game. The music here by Yasunori Mitsuda hits those highs with the operatic vocals that I didn't even know that I needed to hear, and the ending where Ignis has to watch Noctis, his friend he swore to protect, say his final goodbyes before they both know that he has to sacrifice himself is the exact sort of storytelling I love to see in Final Fantasy XV. What the fuck was 16-year-old me smoking on, man? Maybe all those years ago I expected another giant open world with side missions, and that's why I didn't remember this one all that much. But again, episode Ignis is the best of the DLC episodes. It's no contest. And of course there's the extras like a bonus boss fight with Noctis, but you know what we're here for. The biggest thing in episode Ignis is its alternate ending. This is where 15 gets a little weird. You see, for some reason, once you complete the main story of this episode, there's a verse 2. Not unlike the additional chapter 13 that was patched into the original game, except instead of playing as somebody else, here this verse 2 is a what if scenario. Since Ignis knows how all of this will end, he gets the choice between following his path in the original game, wearing the Ring of the Loose Sea and going blind, or playing along with Ardyn's plan and going to the crystal to act as bait for Noctis. When you go to the crystal, somehow the voice of Luna gives Ignis all of the information she has on Ardyn, how he was the original king and was betrayed, yada yada yada. Ignis tries to save Noctis from his fate by wearing the ring and sacrificing his life, giving him enough time to destroy Ardyn's physical body. Noctis then uses the ring to heal Ignis, and the game ends. During the credits, it's revealed that this new ending circumvents a lot of the big story beats from the latter half of 15 after Altissia. Ignis doesn't go blind, Ravus doesn't die, presumably Prompto never figures out that he's a soldier of Niflheim. I'm not too sure if that's a pro or a con. Noctis' 10-year slumber still occurs, but Eos was prepared for this thanks to Ignis' knowledge, so it's implied that a lot more people survived that decade-long gap than before. The final scene shows an alive Noctis ruling as king as he was somehow able to stop Ardyn without killing himself, as he and Ignis smile at each other. A happy ending in a Tabata game. I thought I'd never fucking see it. While this is all fine and dandy and offers some good fan service, it's not the best ending. It is all tied up a little too neatly in a bow. But the more important part is it makes you wonder, why now? Why randomly include an alternate ending in the final piece of 15's story? Well, as a Final Fantasy XV veteran who was there at launch, I think that Verse 2's sole purpose was to get the player base used to the idea of alternate endings. You see, episode Ignis was released in December of 2017, and was the final piece of DLC for the Season Pass. 3 episodes and Comrades were promised, and now 15 was complete. Right? In your fucking dreams, loser! Episode Ignis would be the final piece of DLC for 15 up until Royal Edition released in March of 2018 with all its new stuff and additional ending, and that was sold as the big definitive edition. Except back at Square, the dev team, which were now its own subsidiary studio called Luminous Productions, were already planning on 4 new DLC episodes in a story titled Dawn of the Future to be released in spring of 2019, which also eventually got adapted into a book, and the entire concept behind both stories is an alternate ending where Bahamut is revealed to be the true evil mastermind behind everything, which I guess makes sense even in the original game. I haven't read the book myself, so at this point I'm just as lost as you are. The 4 episodes would be Ardyn, Luna, Armenea, and Noctis? Had these been completed, Noctis most likely would have been the new ending for the game as outlined in the novel, where everyone's alive and Noctis and Luna get married and everybody's happily ever after. Yippee. However, when Hajime Tabata left Square in October of 2018 to make his own development studio, and Square was actively losing money running Luminous, $33 million to be exact, they decided to pull the plug on the final 4 episodes to focus on other games. The curse strikes again. I know we got a little comfortable there, but we just had to be reminded and put back in our place by somebody who's fucking upset at Final Fantasy XV existing. The only DLC that was near completion at the time of cancellation was Ardyn, giving us the final piece of Final Fantasy XV for real this time. There's no feeling like skipping something that you don't think is going to be worth your time, only for it to become one of your new favorites. I mean it with my whole chest this time when I say that episode Ardyn is my favorite piece of Final Fantasy XV DLC. I'm sorry, Ignis, you've been dethroned. It's the longest, coming in at a little over 2 hours, and manages to wrap a bow around the entire game in a way that I didn't even think was possible at this point. The story jumps all over the timeline. We see Ardyn's past as a healer 2,000 years before the original game, where his brother Somnus kills the first Oracle, Era, who looks just like Luna, and takes the throne for himself. But the majority of the game is set 30 years before the beginning of Final Fantasy XV, where Ardyn storms Insomnia to fight his brother Somnus, who, since he's a king of Lucis, is a super ghost thing, as well as a young King Regis. Only before Ardyn can kill Regis, he's taken away by Bahamut, who explains that Ardyn's role as a healer and a savior has now been rewritten to be a sacrifice. His place in the story is now to subject the world to 10 years of darkness in order for the true king, Noctis, to fulfill his prophecy, all in a big play that the gods wrote titled Hajime Tabata's Nightmares. By the end of the DLC, when Ardyn learns that he wasn't really betrayed 2,000 years ago, that both his fiancée Era and his brother Somnus knew what would happen to Ardyn and just played their role to fulfill his destiny, he spends his next years of slumber dreaming of killing them, having fully lost any semblance of sanity or humanity, only to then wake up, leading to Final Fantasy XV. I think episode Ardyn is the most tragic that 15 can get. Just the QTE where he tries to prevent Somnus from killing Era, only for it to be unbeatable, is amazing. Although I do think that giving Ardyn the goal of simply fulfilling his role in the gods' grand plan, rather than most of his actions during the game being of his own free will, robs him of his agency a bit. And the more I learn about what the Dawn of the Future ending would have entailed, the more okay I am that it ended up not happening. Episode Ardyn's gameplay builds upon the framework of episode Ignis, with the main character taking over different parts of the city as they work towards their main goal. Except here, that city is Insomnia, the one place that wasn't represented in the main game whatsoever, save for the ending. Finally being able to walk through an intact Insomnia is exactly what I asked for in my original review. The Shibuya inspirations are as clear as day here, and it's so beautiful to finally see it up close. While the city is empty because there's a fucking 30-foot tall pyro destroying shit, you can still see the amount of detail that the devs put into all the buildings. I really wish Noctis escaping Insomnia was still the opening of 15 so that we could see it at night the way it's meant to be seen, but I do appreciate it that this was added before 15 was completed. The city itself is dense with collectibles, destructive items, and shops to buy hats. 10 out of 10 game. The combat is a lot closer to Noctis, but Ardyn has some interesting tricks up his sleeve. Unlike the previous episodes, Ardyn can be upgraded in the Dissension menu as opposed to the Ascension menu. Having Ifrit be Ardyn's companion is genius, and once the two of them are fully upgraded, you're almost unstoppable on normal. Although the overall lack of enemy variety does get a little bit old. The royal guards posted around the city never really change or level up alongside you, and the Guardian mini-bosses are quite literally copied and pasted across the map. It also doesn't help that as DMC-esque as the vocal track is during the raid on Insomnia, it does get a bit grating hearing the same song loop every 2 minutes for an hour or so. But overall, my complaints with episode Ardyn are really minor. This episode really gives me everything else that I could have ever wanted from 15. Some great backstory, an explorable Insomnia, hats? However, I especially love how much the developers clearly wanted to give their respects to the original Versus 13. From Insomnia itself to the opening and this shot of King Regis and Ardyn, it's all taken straight from those initial teasers, and in a way, it feels like this ending is tying itself back into the beginning. Outside of a removed cliffhanger scene to set up the other cancelled DLC, episode Ardyn's story still works as a beautiful ending to 15. One that doubles down on torturing its characters, just like Tabata would have wanted. After this was released in April of 2019, and the Stadia port was released in November of the same year, another strike of the curse, Final Fantasy XV was finally laid to rest after 13 long years. How ironic. Final Fantasy would move on, and the dev team, Luminous Productions, would go on to make Forspoken. And that was fine, right? Wrong! The curse strikes again. This shit is relentless. I think Dawn of the Future not making it was ultimately for the better. Any amount of DLC or added scenes and chapters wouldn't fix the story of Final Fantasy XV. And that's not because it's fundamentally flawed or anything, again, I love the original game, but because our understanding of it was always changed and updated by subsequent material from the beginning. This isn't like Final Fantasies of yore like 7 or 10, where sequels and spin-offs would come years later. 15 was constantly being patched from day 0, but regardless of all that, the ending was always the one part that felt sound, at least to me. The first 3 episodes were fine, since save for Promptos, they all felt like little extra goodies. But the issue I have is that trying to completely rewrite the ending feels a bit more revisionist than I think that the game needed. Again, the original conclusion is fine. It's tied to the themes of the story and is set up from the very beginning. An alternate ending is a neat idea, but it felt like the dev team's scope kind of got away from them. The tragedy was tied to the story, and after having listened and read synopses of what Dawn of the Future could have been, it would have felt like a completely different game. As much as I appreciate the sheer amount of work and dedication Luminous Productions did for the 3 years following 15's release, I don't want to see them attempt to offer something as drastic as a new ending if that was never in the plan from the beginning. Making reactionary decisions at the drop of a hat solely based off of fan feedback is one of the touchier parts of game development nowadays, especially when it comes to single-player story games like RPGs. And I think that sometimes in the pursuit of getting rid of all of the game's kinks, that a project can eventually lose its identity. Rambling aside, 15 has died before, and despite being shut down before Tabata and his team's vision was fulfilled, I am glad that it ended in a way that felt fulfilling. The story is still beautifully tragic, the characters are still captivating, and as someone who's completed the game at 3 different points in time during its development, 15's narrative was heightened by almost all of the additions, and can now be laid to rest as one of my favorite Final Fantasy games with a lot of good DLC. Except for Comrades, fuck you. But now that Nomura is adapting pieces of Versus 13 into Kingdom Hearts, I think a part of 15 will always live on, whether we like it or not. Crossing my fingers that game doesn't succumb to the curse. Don't forget to share this on Rule 34.